Pack up your daughter and go to your mother's house. My ex-wife and the children will stay with us for the time being. It's hard for her now, my husband shouted as he took out my suitcase and my child. But he did not notice that my brother and his friend were already standing behind him. Before we continue, please write in the comments which country you're watching this video from. Enjoy listening. The rain poured relentlessly outside, hammering against the windows of the small suburban house. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Sarah stood frozen in the middle of the living room, clutching her daughter Lily's hand so tightly that the 6-year-old whimpered. Her husband, Mark, towered over her, his face red with anger as he shouted, "Pack up your daughter and go to your mother's house. My ex-wife and the children will stay with us for the time being. It's hard for her now." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Mark's ex-wife, Emily, and their 2 children were coming to their house. And she was supposed to just leave? Her voice trembled as she tried to respond. "Mark, what are you talking about? This is our home. Why would you—" "Don't argue with me, Sarah," Mark snapped, cutting her off. He stormed over to the hallway closet and yanked out a suitcase, throwing it at her feet. "Emily's been through hell. She needs a place to stay, and I'm not going to turn her away. You and Lily can go to your mom's for a few weeks. It's not a big deal." "Not a big deal?" Sarah's voice cracked as she bent down to pick up the suitcase, her hands shaking. "You're kicking us out of our own house for your ex-wife? What's going on, Mark? What aren't you telling me?" Mark avoided her gaze, his jaw clenched. "Just do what I say, Sarah." "I don't have time for this." He turned his back on her and started pulling clothes out of the closet, tossing them into the suitcase haphazardly. Lily clung to her mother's leg, her wide blue eyes filled with confusion. "Mommy, why is Daddy so mad?" she whispered. Sarah didn't have an answer. She knelt down and hugged her daughter tightly, trying to keep her own tears at bay. "It's okay, sweetie. We're going to Grandma's for a little while, okay? It'll be fun." But inside, Sarah was screaming. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Mark had never acted like this before. He and Emily had been divorced for years, and while they were civil for the sake of their kids, Mark had never shown this kind of loyalty to her. What had changed? As Sarah started packing, she heard the front door creak open. Her heart skipped a beat. She glanced over her shoulder and saw 2 shadowy figures standing in the doorway. Her brother, Daniel, and his friend, Ryan. They were both soaking wet from the rain, their faces unreadable. Daniel's eyes locked onto Mark, and Sarah could feel the air shift. "What the hell is going on here, Mark?" Daniel asked, his voice low and dangerous. Mark spun around, his expression darkening. But he didn't notice that Daniel and Ryan were already stepping closer, their fists clenched. Sarah's stomach twisted. She didn't know what her brother was planning, but she knew one thing for sure. This night was about to take a turn for the worse. Mark froze mid-step, the suitcase still in his hand, as he registered Daniel and Ryan's presence. The room seemed to shrink, the tension so thick it was suffocating. "Daniel?" Mark said, his voice faltering for the first time. "What are you doing here?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He took a slow step forward, his boots leaving wet prints on the hardwood floor. Ryan stayed by the door, his broad frame blocking the only exit. "I got a call from Sarah an hour ago," Daniel said finally, his voice steady but laced with anger. "She said you were acting strange, that you were talking about Emily coming over. I didn't think much of it until she texted me again. Said you were kicking her and Lily out, so I came to see for myself, and I brought Ryan, just in case." Mark's eyes darted between the 2 men, then back to Sarah. This is none of your business, Daniel, he snapped, though his confidence was waning. This is my house, my family. You don't get to barge in here and— Your family? Daniel interrupted, his voice rising. You're throwing your wife and daughter out in the middle of a storm for your ex-wife? What kind of man does that, Mark? What aren't you telling us? Sarah watched the exchange, her heart racing. She wanted to speak, to demand answers, but something about the way Mark was acting made her hold back. He was nervous, more nervous than she'd ever seen him. And then she saw it, a flicker of fear in his eyes as he glanced toward the window. What was he looking for? Mark, Sarah said softly, trying to keep her voice calm for Lily's sake. Just tell us what's going on. Why does Emily need to stay here? What's happened to her? Mark hesitated, his shoulders slumping slightly. For a moment it looked like he might actually explain. But then his expression hardened again, and he shook his head. It's complicated, Sarah. You wouldn't understand. Just take Lily and go. I'll explain everything later, I promise. That's not good enough, Daniel growled, taking another step forward. He was now only a few feet from Mark, his towering frame casting a shadow over the smaller man. Ryan shifted by the door, his hand resting on the knob as if ready to lock it. Sarah's stomach churned. She didn't know what her brother was planning, but she didn't like the look in his eyes. Daniel, please, she said, her voice trembling. Let's just talk this out. I don't want anyone getting hurt. But Daniel didn't seem to hear her. His focus was entirely on Mark. You've got 5 seconds to start talking, Mark, he said, his voice dangerously calm, or I swear you're going to regret it. Mark's face paled, but before he could respond, a loud knock echoed through the house. Everyone froze. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a voice, a woman's voice. Mark? Mark, it's me. Let me in, please. It was Emily. Sarah's blood ran cold. She looked at Mark, then at Daniel, then at the door. Whoever was on the other side of that door was about to change everything, and Sarah had a sinking feeling that it wasn't going to be for the better. The knocking grew more frantic, each thud against the door sending a jolt through Sarah's already frayed nerves. Lily whimpered, burying her face in her mother's side. Mommy, I'm scared, she whispered. Sarah stroked her daughter's hair, trying to steady her own breathing. It's okay, baby, she murmured, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. Mark hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He glanced back at Daniel and Ryan, then at Sarah, as if weighing his options. Finally, he muttered, "Stay here," and moved to open the door. Daniel started to protest, but Sarah grabbed his arm. "Let him," she whispered. "I need to know what's going on." The door swung open, revealing Emily standing on the porch, drenched from head to toe. Her blonde hair was plastered to her face, and her eyes were red and swollen, as if she'd been crying for hours. Behind her stood her 2 children, 9-year-old Ethan and 7-year-old Mia, both shivering in their thin jackets. Emily's gaze darted around the room, landing on Sarah. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Sarah saw something in Emily's expression that made her stomach twist. Fear. "Mark! Thank God!" Emily gasped, stepping inside and pulling her children with her. "I didn't know where else to go. He found us again. I had to get out of there." "Who found you?" Sarah asked, before she could stop herself. Her voice was sharper than she intended, and Emily flinched. Mark shot Sarah a warning look, but she ignored him. "Emily, what's going on? Why are you here?" Emily opened her mouth to respond, but Mark cut her off. "Not now, Sarah," he said, his tone firm. He turned to Emily, his expression softening. "You're safe here. Let's get you and the kids settled. Sarah was just leaving." "Like hell I am," Sarah snapped, her patience finally breaking. "I'm not going anywhere until someone tells me what's happening. Who's after you, Emily? And why is my husband so willing to throw us out for you?" Emily's eyes filled with tears, and she looked down at her children, who were clinging to her legs. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," she whispered. "I didn't want any of this. It's my ex-boyfriend, Jason. He's dangerous. He's been stalking me for months, ever since I broke things off. Tonight, he showed up at my apartment. He had a gun, Sarah. I didn't know what else to do, so I called Mark." Sarah's heart sank. A gun? She glanced at Mark, who was now avoiding her gaze again. "And you knew about this?" she asked him, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. "You knew she was in danger, and you didn't tell me?" "I didn't want to worry you," Mark said quietly. "I thought I could handle it." "Handle it?" Daniel interjected, his voice booming. "By kicking your wife and daughter out of their own home? What kind of logic is that, Mark? And what happens if this Jason guy shows up here? Did you even think about that?" Mark didn't answer, but the look on his face said it all. He hadn't thought that far ahead. Sarah felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She looked at Emily, then at her children, then at Lily, who was still clinging to her. They were all in danger now, weren't they? Before anyone could say another word, the lights flickered. Once, twice, then went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. A collective gasp filled the room, followed by the sound of Lily's terrified sob. Sarah's heart raced as she pulled her daughter closer. "Mark," she whispered, her voice shaking. "What was that?" But Mark didn't respond. Instead, she heard the faint sound of footsteps coming from outside the house. The room was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside, barely filtering through the rain-streaked windows. The footsteps grew louder, crunching against the gravel driveway. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she tightened her grip on Lily. "Mark," she whispered again, more urgently this time. "Do something." Mark fumbled in the darkness, his hands searching for something, anything, to defend them with. "Stay calm," he hissed, though his voice was shaking. "It's probably just the storm. The power goes out all the time around here." But Sarah knew better. Those footsteps weren't random. They were deliberate, calculated, and they were getting closer. She glanced at Daniel, who was already moving toward the window, his body tense. Ryan followed, pulling a small pocket knife from his jacket. "I'll check it out," Ryan said quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Don't," Emily whimpered, her voice barely audible. "It's him. I know it's him. Jason, he's here." Sarah's blood ran cold. She looked at Mark, who was now standing frozen in the middle of the room, his face pale. "Mark, did you know he might come here?" she demanded. "Did you know he'd follow her?" Mark didn't answer, but the guilt in his eyes was enough. Sarah felt a surge of anger so intense it nearly overwhelmed her fear. "You brought this into our home," she said, her voice low and trembling. "You put all of us in danger, your own daughter included." Before Mark could respond, a loud bang echoed through the house as something, or someone, slammed against the front door. Lily screamed, and Sarah clamped a hand over her daughter's mouth, trying to muffle the sound. "Shh, baby, we have to be quiet," she whispered, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Daniel motioned for everyone to get down, and they all dropped to the floor, huddling together in the darkness. Emily was sobbing silently, her children pressed against her. "I'm so sorry," she kept whispering. "I didn't mean for this to happen." The banging stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow worse. Sarah strained her ears, trying to hear anything. Footsteps, breathing, anything that might tell her where the intruder was. And then she heard it. A faint scratching sound, like nails dragging across the wooden porch. "He's toying with us," Ryan whispered, his voice grim. He tightened his grip on the pocket knife, his eyes locked on the door. "We need to get out of here. Now." "But how?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. "He's out there, and we can't leave the kids." Daniel glanced at her, his expression hard. "There's a back door through the kitchen," he said. "We can make a run for it, get to my car. But we have to move fast, and we have to be quiet." Sarah nodded, though every instinct in her body was screaming at her to stay put. She looked at Mark, who was still standing there, useless, his hands trembling. "Mark," she said, her voice sharp, "you need to help us. For once in your life, do something." Mark's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Okay," he said finally. "Let's go." They began to move, crawling across the floor toward the kitchen. Sarah held Lily close, whispering reassurances even as her own fear threatened to consume her. They were almost at the back door when the front door burst open with a deafening crash. The sound of the front door splintering sent a shockwave through the group. Sarah stifled a scream as she pulled Lily behind the kitchen counter, her heart racing. Emily let out a choked sob, and Mark hissed at her to be quiet. Daniel and Ryan positioned themselves near the kitchen doorway, their bodies tense, ready to fight. Heavy footsteps echoed through the house, slow and deliberate. A man's voice called out, low and menacing. "Emily," he said, drawing out her name like a predator toying with its prey. "I know you're in here. You can't hide from me." It was Jason. Sarah's stomach churned as she realized just how much danger they were in. She glanced at Emily, who was trembling uncontrollably, her hands clamped over her children's mouths to keep them from crying out. "He'll kill us," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "He'll kill us all." "Not if I can help it," Daniel muttered. He nodded to Ryan, who tightened his grip on the pocket knife. "We'll take him by surprise," Daniel whispered. "Sarah, you and Mark get the kids out the back door. We'll hold him off." Sarah wanted to protest, to beg her brother not to put himself in danger, but she knew there was no other choice. She nodded, her throat tight with fear. "Be careful," she whispered. Daniel gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Always am." Mark grabbed Sarah's arm, his grip surprisingly firm. "Come on," he said, his voice low. "We need to move." They began to inch toward the back door, Sarah carrying Lily while Mark helped Emily with her kids. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a gunshot, and Sarah's heart pounded in her ears as they moved. They were almost there, just a few more steps, when Jason's voice rang out again, closer this time. "You can't run from me, Emily," he said, his tone dripping with malice. "I'll find you, and when I do, you'll wish you'd never left me." Sarah's blood ran cold. She glanced back and saw a shadow moving through the living room, heading straight for the kitchen. They were out of time. "Go!" Daniel hissed, shoving Sarah toward the door. She didn't hesitate. She pushed the back door open and stumbled out into the rain, Lily still in her arms. Mark and Emily followed, dragging the kids behind them. The cold air hit Sarah like a slap, but she didn't stop. She ran toward Daniel's car, her feet slipping on the wet grass. Behind her, she heard a shout, followed by the sound of a struggle. Her heart lurched as she realized Daniel and Ryan were fighting Jason. She wanted to go back, to help her brother, but she couldn't, not with Lily in her arms. She had to keep her daughter safe. They reached the car, and Mark fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. "Hurry!" Sarah snapped, glancing back at the house. She could still hear the sounds of the struggle, grunts, crashes, and then a blood-curdling scream. Mark finally got the car door open, and Sarah practically threw Lily inside before climbing in after her. Emily and her kids piled into the back, their faces pale with terror. Mark jumped into the driver's seat and started the engine, his hands still trembling. "We need to go," he said, his voice hoarse. "Now." Sarah didn't argue. She glanced back at the house one last time, her heart in her throat. The sounds of the fight had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Where were Daniel and Ryan? Were they okay? She couldn't bear the thought of losing her brother, but she knew they couldn't go back. Not yet. Mark peeled out of the driveway, the car skidding on the wet pavement. The rain was coming down harder now, the windshield wipers barely keeping up. Sarah held Lily close, trying to calm her own racing heart. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was trying to convince, Lily or herself. They drove in silence for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. Finally, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. "Mark," she said, her voice low but firm, "you need to tell me the truth. All of it. Now." Mark's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He didn't look at her, but after a long moment, he spoke. "I didn't want you to know," he said quietly. "Emily called me a few weeks ago, said Jason had been threatening her. I told her to go to the police, but she was too scared. She said he had connections, that he'd find her no matter where she went, so I told her she could come here if things got bad." Sarah stared at him, her anger boiling over. "And you didn't think to tell me?" she demanded. "You didn't think I deserved to know that you were putting our family in danger?" "I thought I could handle it," Mark said, his voice breaking. "I didn't think he'd actually come after her. I thought—" "You thought wrong," Sarah snapped. She turned to Emily, who was sitting in the back, her face buried in her hands. "And you," she said, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you go to the police? Why did you bring this to my home?" Emily looked up, her eyes filled with tears. "I tried," she whispered. "I went to the police, but they said there wasn't enough evidence to do anything. Jason, he's smart. He knows how to cover his tracks. And when he showed up tonight, I didn't know what else to do. I'm so sorry, Sarah. I never meant for any of this to happen." Sarah wanted to scream, to lash out, but she held herself back. She looked at Lily, who was curled up in her lap, her eyes wide with fear, and she knew she had to stay strong for her daughter's sake. They drove to Sarah's mother's house, arriving just as the first light of dawn began to break through the clouds. Sarah's mother, Linda, rushed out to meet them, her face pale with worry. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. Sarah didn't answer right away. She helped Lily out of the car and handed her to her mother, then turned to Mark. "We're done," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this." Mark didn't respond. He just stood there, his head bowed, as Sarah walked away. As for Daniel and Ryan, they showed up an hour later, bruised and bloodied but alive. They'd managed to subdue Jason and tie him up, leaving him for the police to deal with. But the scars of that night would linger for a long time, for all of them.